we live in an age where we do not only have physical objects, but smart objects. So objects that were recently not digitalized, they are becoming increasingly digitalized. So it's not watches, but smart watches, not washing machines, but smart washing machines. Then this also transfers from single homes, single devices, and single objects to complete infrastructures, to complete cities becoming smart. And at the same time, even new technologies are on the rise. And they have one element in common, and this is the human, because essentially it's the humans who use the objects, who interact with them, who live in the smart cities, who make use of these digital infrastructures, and who interact with new technologies in new ways. So from a psychological perspective, this poses a lot of potential, research potential for supporting humans. And we could perhaps come up with lots of different questions that are not only interesting for psychologists, but lots of other related disciplines as well. For example, we could ask, what potential do these technologies provide for communicating in new ways, to improve learning? How can we support individual decision-making or global goals, even like with regards to sustainability or efficiency? And also, how can we support users with the challenges and implications that these new technologies bring, such as privacy and security implications, which is essentially also my field of research. So just to outline a few examples for what psychologists and other areas could be interested in doing with the aim to support humans in these smart and digital contexts is, we could, for example, develop support tools for elderly people for them to actively participate in digital communication. Or we could design digital applications that allow better sharing of resources among neighbors. Or we could, again, my field of research, design intervention to increase awareness for and to detect misinformation, for example. So there's a huge range of things that we could do to support humans to make use of these new technologies in a promising way. How can we do this? Also, this is not news to you, as you're all researchers, and the process is relatively similar across different disciplines. But generally, we start with the identification of a problem. It can be a need, it can be a research gap, it can be a potential that we identify, and we develop a research question, or perhaps even better, a hypothesis, and then we start developing some kind of intervention. And this is in these marks here to indicate this can all take all forms depending on the research background and the aim of the intervention. It can just be a visual stimulus that we provide. It can be information that we provide. It can be that we design an application, an interface, or a product, or it can be that we trigger some actions based on sensor data that we collected. For example, of course, as researchers, we are very interested in then evaluating the impact of this whatsoever intervention we came up with. And as a psychologist, I'm of course primarily interested in seeing how does this affect human behavior change, decision-making, or perception. Then depending on the outcome, we may have to reiterate, but finally there's a research outcome. This can, for example, be recommendations that we provide to policymakers that then make use of the recommendations to finally design smart cities and the context that we live in. Or we may release some kind of tool or product to the public that then uses them. And of course, then whatever we designed beforehand has a real impact on them. And again, we can see, or we cannot, again, we can see that most of these points again include the human. I think we're stuck here a bit, sorry. Yeah, I think now you can see it. So of course we base the research question on what we see in the public, what we receive as answers from people that we may interview. They are also part of the research question formulation. Of course, they are part of the evaluation when it comes to psychological and human-centered aspects. And then, of course, they are impacted by the research outcome. That's why, for psychologists, and many other different disciplines as well, there are established guidelines for ethical research and practice. And as I already said in the introduction, as a psychologist, I'm of course most familiar with the standards that have been proposed for psychologists, even though they might not be too different from other disciplines. Like in the talks we had before, you could also see that there might be some overlap to other application areas or other like fields of research. However, let's get started with these ones. And why are they so important for smart cities specifically? I mean, of course they are important. That's not to question. And for different types of interventions that we develop, but why should we also specifically consider them in the context of smart cities? First of all, there's like when you ask people, then they really have privacy and ethics concerns when it comes to data collection in smart cities. So there's a niche driven by the people. And also on the other hand, there's already some negative examples that show that sometimes these ethical principles have been neglected, which, for example, led to interventions with initially good intentions to be stopped. And this is also, of course, important if we want to support humans and we do so without considering these aspects, then of course people might not adopt the ideas that we propose for them. And secondly, the second important aspect to consider is the characteristics of smart cities that may fundamentally differ from cities that were not smart. Of course, we already heard a lot about that today, but there's a huge collection of sensitive data through various kinds of sensors or even like body interfaces. Then we have very high degree of digitalization and technology use. So it's very often socio-technical systems that we need to consider. We have a very high degree of complexity and interlinking or interconnectedness between objects, devices, data, and people, which leads to emergent outcomes, meaning that it's not easy to predict from a cause A and outcome B, but that there are so many interactions between the different players in the field that we cannot predict the outcomes and we cannot trace them back to one single root cause anymore. And furthermore, because everything is so interconnected, it's very difficult to stop interventions from cascading through the system. So we have cascading effect, and also the system boundaries, they get increasingly blurred. Like, for example, a year ago, approximately, we wanted to, or we submitted a proposal to the Ethics Commission. We wanted to investigate a smart city app with the aim to enable users to report security critical aspects in the city. Of course, it was a field study, an initial also field study app. It was not to be released to the public, but just test participants. However, then the Ethics Commission came back with a lot of questions. For example, how would we make sure that only the study participants could access that app and no one else? But at the same time, how could we make sure that all people who were interested could benefit from the app? And how could we make sure that the data they entered would not go to any third party or be misunderstood in any way? And here we experience, of course, some of the challenges that we as researchers are also faced with when we want to adhere to these guidelines. So from my point of view, I'm curious to learn whether you have made similar experiences. I feel that these established psychological guidelines that are relatively broad and applicable to many, many areas, but they face some new challenges here. So that's what I wanted to take a closer look at these guidelines that the psychological associations propose. This is a summary of several of the associations, like the German Association, the American Association, Swiss and British Association. If you take that together, they more or less agree on these 5 basic principles, which is respect for persons, indicating that we have to treat all people, regardless of individual differences, respectfully, and that we have to protect and respect their privacy and their autonomy. What we have to do for the good of the people, and we have to take measures to avoid harm or risks. We should be aware of and think about potential consequences, not only in the short term, but also in the long term, and ideally measure them. The interventions that we test or release to the public, they should allow for equal access to and benefit from the intervention. So everyone should have the right and possibility to access it and benefit from it, and there should be no undue burdens for certain groups. And finally, what we done should be done with a certain level of scientific integrity and follow scholarly standards. So far, that all sounds really nice and makes sense, and you can probably see some overlap with the talks we heard before that. And just to show an example of how flexible and adaptable these guidelines are, in 2019, I matched these guidelines to the specific area of nudging in the security and privacy area. So for digital nudges, to see what would be or how would the guidelines look like if we applied them to that certain area. And this worked very well, which you can see as an example here. So now the question arises, can we also apply these principles to the smart city context and smart city interventions? What specific smart city challenges arise? And are there perhaps any missing aspects that we should include? Or should we inform our principles in a new way? Take in insights from new regulations, what we heard about earlier, or other fields, perhaps biomedical fields, because it's not only human-machine interaction, but perhaps also mind and soul and other things that come into play. So here are my initial thoughts about that, a bit informed from the literature, and I'd be happy to discuss these afterwards and perhaps to enrich them even more. So with regards to respect for persons, my feeling was that this is a principle that is generally applicable to the smart city context. However, there it poses some specific challenges. For example, if we define privacy as the right to be free from unwanted intrusion, this can be in conflict with smart city projects that aim for control and automation. Also, generally, as researchers, we want informed consent for data collection. And also this can be very tricky in smart city contexts where ubiquitous sensors measure your data while you just walk past and you might not even be aware of the fact. And then, of course, we've already learned about that too. Surveillance and potential discriminatory practices such as racial bias and face recognition might pose additional challenges for fulfilling that criteria. What can we do as potential measures, perhaps? First of all, and this also came across from recent studies, it's very important to inform people in smart cities about the data collection practices that is going on, and also make them aware of the controls that are in place for them to opt out or opt in, or to have any control over their data. Then perhaps, and there are some new approaches in the literature, make these controls as easy as possible for the people involved. For example, through privacy assistance, where you do not have to necessarily, first of all, to decide for every single device and sensor, but can have some meta decisions that are then implemented for you. And privacy assistance in that sense that they, for you, look out for sensors and data that is collected about you and warn you, and then provide you with control to take measures against that if you're not in line or not supportive of these measures. Then, of course, we should give special consideration to vulnerable groups, and we have heard that before. For example, children who might not be able to understand what the data collection means, but of course, who also walk freely in the smart city and use data as potentially also collected and used. With regards to the second aspect, beneficence, I think, of course, this is generally applicable. However, this is a principle where other interests or other topics might come into play. Like, for example, political factors that want to drive sustainability or to stop climate change, who might on purpose set incentives for certain behavior where certain groups of people might benefit more than others. Like, for example, if I get a financial incentive for using a certain type of energy, and I'm living in a rented flat where I do not have control over the type of energy that is used, I might have a financial disadvantage compared to people who can decide which type of energy to use. So there might be other aspects to consider here, but of course it's in principle applicable. Then one challenge that arises with regards to beneficence is that benefit is perceived differently by different people. For example, research showed that people who live in areas who are perceived to be really safe, and this is probably most likely the more rich areas, they do not feel the beneficence as much as other areas or other people. So how can we then ensure that the intervention is equally good or perceived as good by everyone? Then, of course, we need to carefully balance this trade-off between common good, like sustainability for the complete society, and the benefit for the individual who then perhaps has to make a compromise. So there might be interventions that negatively impact an individual, but as a benefit for society. Also, for example, when it comes to privacy and security aspects, like asked in a study, many people were fine with having their individual data collected for the common good, even though it might be a disadvantage for them personally. But this is something that we need to consider. And what can we do as potential measures here? So first of all, from a psychology point of view, it would be important to include the perceptions, to not only assume what is the common good, but to really include people and ask for their perceptions, and perhaps then develop different interventions for different groups or locations or local populations. And there's a lot of approaches that we might make use of. And then I think it's very important, perhaps we cannot solve them, but at least to communicate and discuss the tensions that also we as researchers uncover, for example, between individual and societal preferences and goals. And then, of course, there should be measures in place to evaluate whether what we wanted to achieve actually had that intended beneficial outcome, or whether there were potential harms for certain groups. With regards to social responsibility, again, I feel this is something that is generally applicable to the smart city context, but also there are some challenges that we need to consider, such as already described with regards to the characteristics of smart cities, it's very difficult to design the system border. So how, with regards to our intervention, can we make sure that we only target the people that we want to target, and that the intervention does not spread any further with unintended consequences, perhaps? And how can we measure long-term effects, given that the technology that we use is so quickly changing that, for example, if I release an app with a certain Android operating system that is not in place in a year from now, it might be very difficult to see long-term effects if this is not longer used or maintained. And then it might also be very difficult to isolate effects as compared to our classical laboratory studies, of course, especially when we consider that interplay with lots of other factors being interconnected with our intervention. So if we release something to the smart city context, if we do field studies, how can we still isolate effects? So what can we do here? One way would to at least get an indication of long-term effects might be to cooperate with already in place measures that, for example, cover multiple societal, economical, and individual aspects. Like, for example, in Switzerland and many other countries, also these panels are in place that measure many aspects, and it might be easier to cooperate with some existing measures than coming up with our own long-term evaluation. And then, of course, it might make sense to think about integrating evaluation measures right from the start in whatever intervention we design, or perhaps a smartphone application. Then justice. I feel this is also something that is generally applicable and we should consider in the smart city context. And here, for example, we might encounter challenges when it comes to digitalization and technology use. For example, if we want an intervention to be accessible for everyone in the same way and for everyone to be beneficial in the same way, then we also have to make sure that everyone actually can use and access. And this might be a problem when it comes to digitalization and people who are not that adept with digital technologies. So there might be the potential exclusion of certain groups that we should be aware of, and where we might think about countermeasures, such as trying to make the intervention as accessible and inclusive from the start, or perhaps even providing additional measures to compensate for what we cannot achieve with our initial intervention. And finally, there's scientific integrity, which of course I feel is also applicable to everything that we do as researchers. However, these smart city contexts, one danger, for example, from my perspective, might be that it seems so easy to launch interventions. So it's so easy to make use of these digital tools to spread information, to launch applications to many, many people, that it might also be easy to overlook some necessary scientific steps, because it's just so promising to just test something out in the wild and have it released without really thinking about standards beforehand. Yes, and also it would be important that you notice that we have reduced control over the intervention as soon as it's like out in the open. And so some countermeasures with this regards might be that, first of all, it would be important to raise awareness that whatever we do in this context may have ethical implications, even if it's not conducted by psychologists, and perhaps also to have some legal enforcement of some standards to check for quality. And finally, it might make sense to implement control measures in the intervention from the start. Like if we encounter that the effects are not as beneficial as we thought, or there are some unintended side effects, then how can we later stop with the intervention, application, whatever it is, if we have not thought about that beforehand? So perhaps this is something that should be like built in. So these were my initial thoughts, and then I thought about, well, these 5 principles, are they now sufficient to cover all the ethical aspects that come into play? Are there any gaps? What other challenges arise? And one of the challenges encountered in the literatures was, and I think this is a very interesting one, that smart cities and the smart city definition is very much technology driven and technology related. And a huge focus so far has been on the technology. So there might be the importance to shift that a bit towards the humans and the human element in the smart city context. So I'm not sure whether this is a new ethical principle, but at least something that should be raised awareness for. And then, of course, what I presented today is the ethical principles for psychologists. And if you look, for example, into the APA Meta Code of Conduct, they say this applies to psychologists and not other disciplines. However, is that true? Perhaps is that something that should transfer to all disciplines? Do all other disciplines also already have similar standards in place? Or might it make sense to come up with some meta-ethical guidelines, especially considering that now also disciplines merge and come together and interact in the smart city context? And what is not psychological research? Like, where's the border for that? Is it not psychological research if it's not done by a psychologist, but for example, measures perception and decision making? Just as a question. And then we have already seen that they were successfully applied to other contexts already, these principles. However, it might be that a concretization of these principles, especially for the smart city context, and raising awareness for the challenges that come with that context might still be very helpful for researchers in the field, even though it does not necessarily change the principles. Then I came across a very interesting question asked in the literature, and I might also like to ask that here. Do we still need scientific integrity or scientific approaches at all anymore if we have this huge database to build on? So if we have all the sensor data available from the smart cities that might already tell us what to do and how to do it. Here's one quote from Anderson: "The data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete." That is a standard that one could take, but I think it should definitely be discussed. But this is questions that I think might come into play when you think about ethics and smart cities. And with that, I'd like to end talking about the considerations that I had, and I would be very happy to include some of your reflections and ideas on that topic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, with a view to the time, I think unfortunately we have to limit our discussion a little bit to 1 or 2 questions. But Andrew would like to explain it? All right. Okay, therefore, just to give the equal opportunity. But Verena thinks a lot. I think that already the task of bringing together these different ethical frameworks and then trying to find a common denominator is already really important. And yes, I can confirm there is a data scientist code of conduct, etc. There's plenty of those and a never-ending story. They all will revolve pretty much around the same principles. In 2014, a colleague and I diagnosed him, Roberto Zigari, we launched an open letter for the ethics of big data, principles for big data ethics. And one aspect, we called it less ambitiously, not beneficence, but do no harm, was actually the one aspect where we have never expected to get pushback. There were people that contacted us and said, we'd love to sign your ethical principles, but because of the do no harm principle, we can't. That was our reaction too. Turns out the military contracts, right? So they have to be able to do harm for the greater good. That's why beneficence is a dangerous one, because it leaves open the possibility to do harm for the greater good. So that is one of the lessons I learned when formulating principles, and we were lucky that we formulated as do no harm rather than do good, right? So maybe one thing that I'd like to give from you. But the other thing that I was missing is one thing that when we think about smart cities, right?
Yes.
There is somebody that eventually has to take a decision, and he or she is informed then by a data scientist, or most likely then not a data scientist, but an administrator, right? One that was not involved in developing the dashboard that he or she is using for understanding what is the data and what does it tell. There is a disconnect between the data that is being collected, the way it is being cleaned and used, then how it is being interpreted through the engineer in visualizing on the dashboard. And then again, the last filter that is being applied, last filter that is being applied, the filter, how it's being interpreted. And then there's a last filter, the translation into policy, that then has made the remoteness of what the data meant and how it required intervention to the actual intervention very, very, very far. How do we deal with that?
That sounds like a very interesting aspect. So would you think this is one of the missing aspects that the principles do not cover yet? Like how we treat the role of the researcher as the interpreter and decision maker and choice architect?
Because that's what I'm questioning. I don't think the researcher is. I think there are so many choices involved and so many filters involved in the process from collecting the data, even like where we position the sensors, right? Is already biased in and of itself. But you know, there are so many biases involved that we lose track of all the biases. That at the end, the decision that we want to then implement has nothing to do anymore with whatever we have measured. So it's a pseudo-scientific approach that I really have a hard time wrapping my head around in the smart city context.
Can I just maybe ask for clarification? Because you talk here about psychological research
and practice.
Okay, but it's also, so I mean, research is also still has an agenda behind it, namely understanding something, creating knowledge. But what you're talking about seems to be decision making, policy making, I don't know, city improvements, whatever. So how do you see your principles for psychological research and practice in the broader smart city context, where people decide about how to govern their city, where to build infrastructures, where to put their big sensors? How does that fit into this greater piece? Because psychological research and practice is just part of that, as we just.
That's absolutely true. But that's why I also included this practice. So, for example, APA makes it clear that these principles do not only apply to research, but also what we do in practice. So what we release.
And then people might say, okay, but I'm not psychological practitioner.
Yeah, that's true. So that's also one of the aspects that I mentioned, right? That they also claim it only applies to psychologists. And then the question arises, so does it really only apply to people who study psychology or who do research and practice that is psychology related? And from psychology point of view, psychology concerns human perception and behavior. And if we take this very, very broad definition of psychology, then we could argue that it comes into play wherever in the smart city, because everywhere we have humans involved.
My question is, do you do that?
Can we do that?
No, do you?
As a researcher, I try to. That's my aim. But as I said, for example, when it comes to beneficence, of course, I understand that there's the policymakers who have the greater good or the common good on their mind, which might be harmful or not beneficial for certain individuals of certain groups. And then I think we have this trade-off that we cannot, perhaps not solve, but where, from my point of view, it's at least important to make that transparent and communicate, perhaps, with the public how to go about this trade-off.
There's a connected question to it, because I think it already starts with talking or trying to study something like a smart city. A couple of years ago, we had a discussion about surveillance, and then there were people from Microsoft, and then this special rapporteur for privacy asked actually a very clever question, which was, why is there no dumb cloud? So why does everything have to be smart? And it sounds very benign when you start with the beginning, but the point is that there's always an agenda behind it, right? So in the case of the cloud and the smart cloud, is that agency that you have when you're having data on a location that you control moves to the cloud. And then you get a sales pitch around why that is good for you, right? And then you can buy it or not. But it's actually a very relevant question. So why are there, then that's the other thing I wanted to ask you. Do you, in your research, do you see people who ask for a dumb city, not a smart city?
That's really a good question.
Perhaps I could follow up on that. Of course, in our ethics course, we had students presenting about smart cities concepts, and it turned out that there are other smart city concepts which are more around sustainability, for example. Using the bike to work, for example, would contribute to this smartness in the sense of making the city more sustainable. So, in effect, there could be, in principle, different concepts of smartness. Traditionally, of course, it's somehow used for digitally enabled, data-driven kind of concepts. But it wouldn't have to be this way, and I do think we would need a healthy competition between different kinds of concepts for cities of the future to see what really are those concepts that people appreciate and that bring us into a better future. So, not a good idea to do the same thing everywhere.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And coming back to your question, there's not even a uniform definition of smart city, right? So there's this is like different concepts that more or less emerge around the idea that, as Dirk said, it's technology driven, it involves data collection, but it's not a clear-cut concept and definition. So asking what is a dumb city like in comparison, it would be very interesting to learn more about what people understand as being a smart city in comparison to a not smart or dumb city. And I mean, from this initial research that I presented, we can already see that beneficence of these smart interventions is seen differently. I have not encountered research that said that people did not see any value in it, but it's perceived differently. So it might be more beneficial for some groups or locations as compared to others.
So if I apply the principles that you mentioned, now if I put myself in the position of policymaker, you as a psychologist, now asking you, there's a group of people that are very concerned about the privacy. Could you design me psychological interventions that make them less concerned, so we can do what we wanted to do? Because we know it's good for them. What would your principles mean for that question? How would you have to answer?
But that's another interesting question. Asking, we know what is good for them, but do they perceive it in the same way? So if we look at that beneficence principle, I think the question has to be asked a bit. Is that also perceived as beneficial by the people who are concerned? And then it might make sense to include them beforehand in the process, other than like top down.
But here regarding, it's in between your intervention or your question of what you were saying, who is deciding what is good? Because here you have the issue about legitimacy and deciding which is the good or which should be the policy. Yeah, but that's the thing. Like here you have as well a controversy about legitimacy and deciding which is the division of the city, which is actually as well like a very like trouble zone, like area ground for policymakers, where legitimacy and political legitimacy is inserted on this kind of frameworks in connection to the policymakers, because as well like in between we are as well like addressing policymakers like another agent, like a cohesive, coherent body in the city, which is not the case. In most of the cases, you have like many contradicting agendas within policymakers, or people who are actually have different roles in that situation. So within that this framework, actually, how is in this particular case like political legitimacy inserted into this kind of like in this research?
Yeah, well, when we think about, of course, the decision makers in the smart cities, they bear a huge responsibility, but not only with regards to smart cities, but in general, right? So I think when we talk about psychological principle of ethics, then here another very important aspect is transparency. So if we assume or we had an idea what we believe is good for the people and we launch an intervention to achieve exactly that, then it would, from the psychological perspective, at least be a good idea to make what you do very transparent so that the people know what is happening and why it is happening, so that you can also easily detect mismatches between your assumption and what the people think about that.
Another case, for being very, very concrete, the case, and we have mentioned in this case sometimes about the Queen's Quay in Toronto, like this city that Google Alphabet wanted to develop and failed dramatically, particularly because it's been very transparent. And by being very transparent, naturally, people started to realize of all those dark areas about implementing a smart city. And at the end, they were asking themselves, like, do we really need to collect all this kind of data for having like a neighborhood and use for each of that in a neighborhood? So actually, there was question of like, which is the limit actually of a smart city and the need for being that smart. Maybe we need to be smart in a different way. This is not necessarily asking for a dumb city, but it's about redefining which are the smartness that they were referring. And eventually, Alphabet, that is not because of lack of money, because they have as much resources, economical resources they may want, they fail, and the project fall apart in that sense. So, and I think it's kind of connected to that. There are like examples that by being, and this is very as well, like it's very contextual and it's very to the particular way of doing policy making. For example, in Toronto, that's true that neighborhoods and citizens traditionally has got a lot of power in intervening and blocking. Sometimes it's just well detrimental, but they can block the decision making or the planning in the city. But in that sense as well, there are like examples where it's articulated in this way that is, I mean, you have kind of like beta testing of these kind of approximations to these frameworks. So like, okay, in some cases where it has been very transparent, actually it seems like it can work for changing or nudging the policy making in cities.
That's a very interesting thing. So if you have a nice reference on that, it'd be very interesting to
you share a few months ago a paper, particularly like research that was. Yeah, I will.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. There was another question, I think, right?
Yeah, there was one here.
Let's make it last.
Yeah.
Me? Okay, I can ask. So, you have 5 values here.
responsibility, beneficence, respect, integrity, and justice.
Yeah, this was the ones defined by the psychological associations across different countries. Yes.
I know. But there has been, for example, a recent paper in Nature that showed how over 100 institutions from OECD all across the world, they have this list of ethical principles that they think should be respected in technology design. I can send the paper around by Jobin and all those.
Yeah, yes, please, yes.
The thing is that, so I think one question interesting to ask is, except for the fact that you happen to have that source, is why do you choose that source and those 5 particular values and not, for instance, care, transparency, and in our case studies, we think about 50 values. 50 to 100 values actualizing around one piece of technology. So far beyond what any kind of value list of existing framework is summarizing. That's one thing. So making clearer what drives the reasoning for your particular choice of list. And the second thing is the object of study. Because now we meet here and we talk about a city, but city, what is the system of interest in our standard that I will present tomorrow? We talk about the system of interest. Is it the water system in the smart city? Is it the communication system? Is it the schooling system? Is it the I don't know, the surveillance system? So the thing is to talk about something called city. Is when it comes to ethical analysis a very broad concept. And I don't want to dismiss the virtue of your research here, but it's just something that I think as a scientific community we need to think about, because ethics for 2,000 years or 2,500 years has developed around individual people talking to each other. We have an ethical context, a certain situation in which we take moral decisions and so on. And now we take that philosophy and we kind of completely zoom out and talk about the world and cities or whatever. And so I'm sometimes wondering to what extent we do ourselves a favor without doubting that research is important to have, really important to have. But I think the system of interest is very important to consider.
I absolutely agree with what you have to say. And I think this is especially one of the challenges that I pointed out. Like, where's the system border? Can we draw a border? What do we look at? Like the intervention that we launch, what is it initially targeted for? However, does it spread beyond the system that we had in mind with our intervention? And are there any unintended side effects from that potential spread or transfer to other systems? So I think this is a very important question to consider as a researcher, but also in practice, to get a better understanding of, like, what is the target, what is the system. So I absolutely agree there. And with regards to the ethical principles, also I'd be very interested to take a closer look at a list of different disciplines. I have not yet done that, but chosen the psychological ones as a starting point, as I am a psychologist, and these are the principles that guide research and practice that involve human behavior and decision making. And I deem these especially relevant considering human-centered intervention in smart cities that do not necessarily serve a medical context, for example.
That was also my understanding that it was not thought to replace all the other lists
Absolutely
of
not.
principles, but more like, given that smart cities implicitly experiment with people, what do the ethical principles of for psychological experiments imply for how we would have to organize?
Yeah, so they more serve as a starting point to foster the discussion. And as I pointed out here, there might be a lot of missing aspects that other disciplines perhaps have already incorporated or thought about, or perhaps what you mentioned before, like values. They may somehow implicitly inform these principles, but perhaps there's even more to them. And perhaps this might be something to add there too.